And then Patrick said he was going to take on the Monkey Man in the eighth dimension, and then SpongeBob replied, smaller. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there, my bad. But now that you're here, do you want to have a seat so we can talk about some history? Is this a history show now? Well, I don't know. Do you remember the History Channel? It used to be this really awesome network that had classics like Dogfights and Shootout and infinite amounts of World War II history documentaries. You know that one. And then once it was over, you might pop over onto the Discovery Channel and maybe catch an episode of Mythbusters or Seconds from Disaster or something. And now the History Channel is just Pawn Stars and American Pickers and Ancient Aliens, and the Discovery Channel is Deadliest Catch and Ice Road Truckers. Well, that was the History Channel when I was growing up anyway. But if you want to talk about some American history, let's talk about some American history. So I was actually a pretty good student in history class growing up. It was the only class that I ever got an A in high school, but there's a lot of stuff that you don't actually learn about in American history class in high school. So I want to talk about a gentleman that you might have heard of, but you might not know anything about, or how cool he actually became in his later life. We're going to be talking about one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history, and his name is Smedley Darlington Butler. He was a complicated guy, but we'll get into that. So Smedley Butler was born on July 30th, 1881 in Pennsylvania. He was the oldest of three boys, and his parents were Quakers. Smedley's dad, Thomas Smedley, was a lawyer who would eventually get elected into the U.S. House of Representatives, where he would serve for 31 years. He would end up being the House of the Naval Affairs Committee during the Warren Harding administration and the Calvin Coolidge administration. Did those guys do anything noteworthy? I feel like you don't really hear a lot about Warren Harding or Calvin Coolidge, but that's not important. That's not what this is about. This isn't about Smedley's dad. This is about Smedley Butler. He grew up in Pennsylvania. He attended a private school that was popular among the affluent and aristocratic classes in the 1800s and early 1900s. But almost upon graduating high school, about 1,300 miles away in Cuba, things weren't normal. In the 1890s, revolutionaries in Cuba were trying to fight for freedom from Spain. The United States government, fearing regional instability and with the opportunity of economic interests and money to be made, U.S. industrialists and politicians desired new territories. This is like the peak of American expansionism into what we know the United States empire as today. This fear for instability, which in Cuba, which was at the time a very big trading partner with the U.S., they viewed the location as very strategically important. So they decided to support the Cuban revolutionaries against Spain, and newspaper outlets, notably ran by dickhead William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, would publish exaggerated and false stories about Spanish atrocities within Cuba itself. I don't know, fake news maybe. So this was called yellow journalism, and yellow journalism manufactured consent to go to war with Spain. And everyone got, riled up in a fervor when in February 1898, the USS Maine exploded and sank in Havana Harbor, and this killed 260 American sailors. The press was quick to blame Spain, even though evidence now that we have points that it was probably an accident. This led to the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, and to hell with Spain." So 38 days before Smedley Butler was due to graduate from high school, he lied about his age and directly commissioned into the Marines as a second lieutenant. That was a thing you could do at 17 back then? Whatever. So he lies about his age, and he's a second lieutenant in the Marines. By July 1898, he was stationed in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Why does that sound familiar? I will investigate that no further. So he arrived shortly after its successful invasion and capture. He didn't really do a whole lot in Cuba. He returned home, and then he was assigned to the USS New York for 4 months. And then in 1899, he came home, and he was actually due to be discharged from the Marines, but instead he accepted a commission as a first lieutenant in the United States Marines. Now, a lot of things happened as a consequence of the Spanish-American War, notably the Treaty of Paris that was signed in 1898 by the United States and Spain. It gave control of the Philippines to the United States of America for about $20 million. Now, believe it or not, the Philippine citizens were not super enthusiastic, you might say, about being under new management, ditching one power out for a new one. So this discontent led to Philippines citizens uprising and it basically led to an insurrection by the Philippine citizens in the Philippines. So this brutal occupation of the Philippines that the United States was undertaking was, believe it or not super popular. So this brings us to our guy, Smedley Butler. He was sent to the Philippines, but by the time he got there wasn't a whole lot to do. And he actually turned into a little bit of an alcoholic because he was so bored out of his mind. He actually ended up getting temporarily relieved of command for some unspecified incident that happened. I don't know. This guy seems like a real Marine to me. But in October 1899, he led 300 Marines to take the town of Noveleta from Philippine insurgents. The Marines ultimately successfully occupied the town. One Marine had been killed, 10 were wounded, and another 50 had been casualties because, fighting in the jungle, it's hot, humid, sucks, and you get end-stage swamp ass, which can really, wipe you out. No pun intended. This experience actually excited Smedley Butler, but before he could see any other action, there was another problem happening in China. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, China was well into the century of humiliation, mainly because of Western influence and, corporations. Western powers were basically carving up land in China, getting them addicted to opioids, which led to severe economic hardship, as you can imagine. There was severe droughts and floods in northern China. In the 1890s, displaced rural farmers were having their land cut up by big railroad companies. And this ultimately led to a group known as the Boxers to basically take matters into their own hands and fight against Western influence in China. So Smedley Butler was sent to China to help take care of it. In 1900, in one battle, he was shot in the leg, and another Marine tried to get him to safety, but that Marine was also shot. In this battle, Smedley Butler would be recommended for the Medal of Honor, but due to the time period as a commissioned officer, he was not eligible to be awarded the Medal of Honor. So he gets shot in the leg. He's not eligible for a Medal of Honor, but at 19 years old, he is promoted to captain, which is kind of insane if you think about it. Because, I think about what I was doing at 19 years old, and this dude was a captain in the Marines. I really feel like I'm falling behind. But now let's talk about how bananas things are about to get. And if you've never heard about the Banana Wars and the United Fruit Company, here's a quick summary of what they were responsible for. So instability in South America, largely due to foreign influence and corporations like the United Fruit Company, they gave a great opportunity for U.S. interests to take advantage of political instability. In countries like Nicaragua, Haiti, Honduras, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, it gave pretext for U.S. intervention to install pro-American governments that would be pro-business, businesses like the United Fruit Company. And I know you're worried. You're like, okay, well, pro-American companies, they're usually pretty pro-labor, and they allowed their workers to organize, and, they got good time off and good wages and working conditions. No, absolutely not. It was basically just slavery. And, ultimately this led to uprisings against the United Fruit Company and American interests in the region. So Smedley Butler was hanging out in Puerto Rico, and when the U.S. government got wind of instability in Honduras, his unit was ordered to sail to Honduras and defend U.S. interests and the U.S. consulate there. The Marines landed at the town of Puerto Cortes and prepared for war, but all they found was a quiet town full of normal people, just doing normal people stuff, trying to just get by and live their life. So the Marines quickly left, and they continued sailing up the coast to try and find some violence, which they eventually did. There was a rebel group of Honduran soldiers fighting the rebels, and there was a huge gun battle there. But when the Marines came, the fighting had ceased. The Marines went to the American consulate, where they found the U.S. consul wrapped in an American flag and hiding on the floor. The Marines would leave after rescuing the U.S. consul and the U.S. consulate from violence, and then the violence between the Honduran government and the rebels would begin again as soon as the Marines left. After his military actions in Honduras, Smedley Butler would return home, where he would get married, and he was then again stationed in the Philippines. In 1908, he got 9 months of sick leave, and during this period, he was managing a coal mine in West Virginia. That doesn't sound good. I'm sure coal mines in the early 1900s in West Virginia were good places to be, right? Okay, whatever. I'm not going to investigate that any further. In 1909, Smedley Butler would return to active duty. Nicaragua specifically is where he would be deployed to further, enforce U.S. policy and defend American interests in Nicaragua. He would eventually be stationed in Panama, but he really wasn't having a good time in these operations, and he would say, quote, What makes me mad is this whole revolution is inspired by finance, by Americans who have wildcat investments down here and want to make them good by putting in a government which will declare a map of monopoly in their favor. The whole business is rotten to the core. While stationed in Panama in 1914, Smedley Butler would be redeployed to Mexico as a spy alongside a plan that was created by Frank Fletcher. They devised a plan to infiltrate Mexico to gather intelligence for a potential invasion and monitor any revolutionary activity. Smedley Butler posed as a railroad official named Mr. Johnson. That is not the fakest name that I have ever heard, but I guess it was a different time back then. And he traveled to Mexico City, claiming that he was looking for a lost employee. With this ruse, he gained access to various areas. He was able to locate weapons, determine the size of the Mexican army units, and he would be able to map out railroad routes in Mexico. He would return with intelligence on March 7th, though the invasion plan was scrapped following the Tampico affair, which is basically what happened is 9 Navy sailors went ashore in Mexico and they were taken captive by the Mexican government. This led to some hostilities and would eventually lead to the Battle of Veracruz. Woodrow Wilson would learn about an incoming arms shipment and sent the Marines in to intercept it. This did not, bode well among the local populace. They were not a huge fan of having, Marines invade their country. So fighting broke out on April 21st. Smedley Butler's Marines, they faced sniper fire, but utilizing door-to-door searches, they were able to successfully root out resistance by April 26th. By April 26th, the city was secured and the conflict ultimately resulted in 17 American deaths, 63 wounded American military casualties, and Mexican forces suffered 126 deaths and 195 wounded. The Battle of Veracruz would actually lead to Smedley Butler getting his first Medal of Honor, although an unusually high number of Medals of Honor were awarded during this operation, about 56 in total. The Medal of Honor is not what it is now. It used to kind of be like handed out like candy. If you ever want to learn more, you should look at how many Medals of Honor got given out in the Civil War. So during World War I, Smedley Butler would attempt to return his Medal of Honor, claiming that he really hadn't done a whole lot to deserve it. But he was ultimately ordered to keep it and wear it. But that was besides the point, because in 1915, the Haitian president was assassinated. And the U.S. sent, guess who, Smedley Butler and other Marines to Haiti to quell the Caco Rebellion. On October 24th, Smedley Butler and his patrol of 44 Marines was ambushed by 400 rebels. Despite being outnumbered, they held their perimeter overnight and they routed the enemy the next morning. In November, Smedley Butler led a force of 700 Marines to clear the area and captured several forts, driving the rebels back into their final stronghold, the Fort Riviera. It was this old French fort atop the Montagne Noire. I hope I said that right, but I don't really care about, French words. So Butler, along with the 15th Company of Marines, found a small opening in the fort at the southern wall. They breached it and engaged in violent hand-to-hand combat. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes, and the Marines came out on top, crushing the resistance, killing about 50 rebels, with only about 1 Marine injured, who only lost 2 teeth. So due to these actions in this Fort Riviera battle, Smedley Butler was awarded his second Medal of Honor for his extraordinary heroism and leadership during the capture of the Fort de Riviera. He became one of only 2 Marines in history to receive the Medal of Honor twice. The award was recommended by then Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You might know him as FDR, or the president that got polio and he did nothing else. After the battle, Smedley Butler organized the Gendarme de Haiti, which was essentially the national police force, and he was credited with restoring social order to the country. He later starkly recalled the campaign, noting that he and his troops hunted the Caco rebels like pigs. So at the outbreak of World War I, Smedley Butler really wanted a combat role, but he didn't get one, which I think is kind of insane. Like, if it was me, like, out of all the wars to be a part of, I feel like World War I is definitely like the number one list, or like at the top of the list as far as like wars that I don't want to go to the front line in. Like, all war is bad, but if you know anything about history, World War I was like especially miserable. That's kind of insane. But this is the guy that Smedley Butler was. He was a little bit insane. But he was considered unreliable by his superiors, so he did not actually get the opportunity to serve at the front. Instead, he was basically put in a logistics role in charge of a logistics depot that was kind of in a crisis. This logistics depot was suffering from like overcrowding, disorganization, unsanitary conditions, and disease, and people pooping themselves to death, just like stuff that happens in modern war or the war of old. But most casualties in war do come from disease. That is a thing that has happened for centuries, and it's not any different today. But Butler would undertake a massive mission to basically make this depot better. There was like mud-soaked tents, so he would actually raid the dock for duck boards, and he would personally carry the first wooden board up a 4-mile hill, and this would earn him the nickname Old Duck Board. For his leadership in transforming the camp to be efficient, he received high honors, including the Army Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, and the French Order of the Black Star. He was also promoted to Brigadier General. I don't know. This guy seems pretty cool. So in 1919, following the end of World War I, Smedley Butler would become the commanding general of the Marine Corps Barracks, Quantico, Virginia. Now, this was basically just like a super temporary training camp, but eventually, under Smedley Butler's leadership, it would become basically like the pride and joy of the United States Marines. He would gain national fame by leading Marines on long marches to Civil War battle sites like Gettysburg, where they would perform like large-scale reenactments for crowds. In 1921, during a training exercise during the Wilderness Battlefield, this is just an interesting thing that happened. A farmer told Butler that Stonewall Jackson's arm was buried nearby. He didn't believe the farmer initially, but he did actually, organize a search party, and they dug at the spot, and they sure found an arm in a wooden box. So Smedley Butler took the wooden box and put the arm in a metal box and then reburied it, which seems like a good idea. I mean, I'm not super superstitious, but I just feel like, stealing a racist Confederate general's arm out of a box from a Civil War battlefield, it sounds like a recipe for shenanigans. I'm not sure. But he would unfortunately put a monument in the spot, which, I mean, let's be real here, like The Office, the TV show The Office lasted longer than Confederacy. Can we stop worshiping these fucking weirdos? In 1924, Mayor Freeland Kendrick of Philadelphia asked President Calvin Coolidge to lend a hand in, cleaning up the city of crime and corruption. So Calvin Coolidge authorized Smedley Butler leave from the Marines to take the job. Smedley Butler would organize all 4,000 Philadelphia police officers inside the Opera House, and he would announce that things are going to change. Although he didn't really have any power to fire corrupt individuals, he did undermine, corruption by basically just putting them in different parts of the city so they really couldn't organize. But Smedley Butler's approach to law enforcement was not popular, to say the least. Within 48 hours of becoming the police commissioner, he organized over 900 raids in speakeasies, destroying many, like targeting working class establishments, but also upper class establishments like the Ritz-Carlton, which I think is kind of based. I mean, if you're going to go after poor people, you should go after rich people too. But he would introduce military-style checkpoints, armored cars. He changed the police uniform to be modeled after the Marine Corps uniform. And he would say things like, I don't believe that there's a single bandit notch on policeman's guns, so go out and get some. So his approach to policing and the unpopularity of it really kind of started fracturing his relationship with the mayor. And in 1925, Smedley Butler would resign, stating, cleaning up Philadelphia was worse than any battle I'd ever been in. All right, where was I? Sorry about the break. It was really hot, so I wanted to take my shirt off. Who were we talking about? Oh, yeah, Smedley Butler. So in 1926, Smedley Butler returned to active duty in the Marines, and in 1926, he was sent to San Diego, California, to become the new commander of Marine Base San Diego. This basically marked his return to active duty. Not a lot happened there. But in 1927, Smedley Butler, he's just sitting around in Marine Corps Base San Diego, and, the Marines got another job for him. This time again, he would find himself in China. So he was deployed to command the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade in Tianjin, and the goal was to protect American citizens and property during another internal conflict in China because, basically a bunch of warlords were running the entire show. Then there was also nationalist forces that we were trying to, help out a little bit. But unlike his earlier aggressive campaigns, Butler would basically formulate an early version of what we know today in the military as COIN, or counterinsurgency operations, which is basically, hey, don't blow up citizen stuff, and they might actually support you if you are nice to them. I don't know. It seems like maybe we didn't learn anything from good old Smedley Butler, but he successfully navigated Chinese tensions in the area, and through using diplomacy, he was able to negotiate with both sides, and he was actually able to get a lot of goodwill from the Chinese population. But on December 24th, 1927, just as to show you the kind of guy that Smedley Butler was, a fire broke out at the Standard Oil Tank Farm, and Smedley Butler personally directed the firefighting effort, standing on top of a barrel nearby, an oil fire. And ultimately, his efforts saved the facility. So, yay, Standard Oil. Way to go, Smedley Butler. But ultimately, his time in China was marked as a success because he did not have a singular American casualty in combat. And ultimately, the Chinese population actually did kind of support what he was doing. When the Marines departed in 1929, they were cheered on by the local populace, which, it's pretty rare to get the local populace to cheer you on when you're, on their territory. It kind of just, it's not a super popular thing to do. Maybe we can learn from that, but I don't know. I don't know. In 1929, Smedley Butler was promoted to Major General, which was the highest rank that you could attain in the United States Marines at the time. He was reassigned to Quantico, and he did have some hopes and dreams of maybe becoming the commandant of the Marine Corps someday. But then he started getting a little bit spicy, as you could say, doing really funny things like causing international incidents with Italy. you know, Italy. In 1931, he would deliver a speech that did cause an international incident, but I think it's kind of a funny one. He was telling an anecdote that was told to him by a friend, and according to the story, his friend was riding in a car with Benito Mussolini, and the car that they were driving in, they were speeding through a town, and he hit and killed a child allegedly, and reporting he didn't stop, and he reportedly turned to his passenger and he said, "What is one life in the affairs of the state?" The Italian government was not very happy with this, and U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson was forced to issue a formal apology to Mussolini. President Hoover, who already had kind of a tense relationship with Butler, ordered him to be court-martialed, and our boy Smedley Butler, just showing off that he really was a true Marine, would be the only Marine officer to be placed under arrest since the Civil War. But despite this, public sentiment was largely on Butler's side. We used to be a proper country. Uh, Seeing a potential PR disaster, the administration canceled the court martial, and Butler was issued a formal reprimand instead. The former commandant of the Marine Corps, Wendell Neville, he died in 1930. But due to, some of these comments and, not really getting along with the current administration, he was passed up for promotion, even though he had broad support from the Marines, the local populace, the general populace, and other officers in the Marine Corps. He was passed over for the position and in favor of Major General Ben Fuller. He kind of realized that his path in the Marines was, done, and he would put in for retirement. And officially on October 1st, 1933, after a 33-year career being one of the most decorated Marine Corps servicemen in U.S. history, he would leave the Marines. After his retirement from the Marines, after that, like I said, 33-year career, he would venture into a different battlefield, the battlefield of politics. Yay! He would announce his candidacy for senator for Pennsylvania in March of 1932. He ran as a Republican and was a strong proponent of prohibition. Gross. He was ultimately defeated in the primary election, receiving only 37.5% of the vote, compared to the incumbent's 60%. That, my friends, is what we call a landslide. In the midst of Smedley Butler's entry into politics, there was another kind of battle going on. In the midst of the Great Depression in 1932, approximately 43,000 demonstrators, including 17,000 World War I veterans, their families, and supporters, marched on Washington, D.C. Why? Well, they were demanding immediate cash payments of their service certificates, which were essentially a bonus for their World War I service. Under the World War I Adjusted Compensation Act of 1924, these certificates were not redeemable until 1945. But many of these veterans were destitute, starving, and out of work as a consequence of the Great Depression. They needed that money. They needed it now. I have a government certificate and I need cash now. Call Smedley Butler 1877 cash now. These veterans, their families, and supporters would set up a lot of different camps, with the largest being in Anacostia Flats, where they lived in essentially a shanty town and a bunch of tents. If you ever want to learn more, you should look up Hoovervilles. That's kind of what it was. Don't worry, those are back on the menu for this year, so yay. But anyway, so they were living in basically just destitution and abject poverty. But Smedley Butler, he had their backs, and he would come in and visit this camp of what would become known as the Bonus Army to show solidarity for their struggle. He arrived on July 19th, and he walked around with the men. He ate with them. He delivered a famous fiery speech saying, quote, "Makes me so damn mad that a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 1918. He argued that they had just as much right to be there to lobby the government in order, to advance their own interests as any steel corporation, which based. That's cool, man. I like that. I like that a lot. He urged them to remain, disciplined and nonviolent to keep public sympathy on their side. He also said to use their voting power to remove any politicians who oppose them. He told them to basically lick the hell out of any politician who wouldn't support them at the polls, which again, based. Just 9 days after Smedley Butler was visiting the soldiers in the camp, President Herbert Hoover had had enough of this bonus army nonsense. So he would order two famous historical dickheads whose reputations have somehow not been, scarred by history, but whatever, that's another topic for another time. But those two historical major dickheads, we had one, Douglas MacArthur, and two, General George Patton. American troops would use tear gas, bayonets, and tanks against the veterans and their families, and they burned this shantytown to the ground. Congratulations, you just burned down the only thing that these people had, and they already had nothing. Good job, U.S. government and the Herbert Hoover administration, Douglas MacArthur and George Patton. That's awesome. But ultimately, as a result of this, two veterans were shot and killed, and hundreds were injured, including a veteran's wife who had a miscarriage. I just want to remind you that the people living in this shanty town during the midst of the Great Depression were normal people. They were normal American citizens and their families. They had nothing, and the government took the nothing that they had from them somehow. That's crazy. But Smedley Butler was very angry about this, if you can imagine that. He was horrified, and he started to become actively hostile towards the Hoover administration, describing himself as a Hoover for ex-president Republican, and he actively campaigned against Hoover's reelection. After witnessing what had happened to the Bonus Army, Smedley Butler would become increasingly sympathetic towards the left-wing movement in the United States. Once a dedicated enforcer of U.S. foreign policy and a supporter of U.S. foreign intervention, he would become a vocal critic of military intervention, the banking industry, and fascism. Cool, man. You're starting to really get on my side here. In 1933, he toured with the VFW, or the Veterans of Foreign Wars, to organize veterans, urging them to get involved in politics and stop being placed in the sucker class. He harshly criticized the rival to the VFW, the American Legion, as being controlled by bankers who trade ordinary soldiers. He denounced the FDR administration for its ties to big business, and he criticized the Economy Act of 1933, which cut veterans' benefits. In November of 1934, Butler alleged that he was approached by Gerald P. McGuire, a bond salesman. This bond salesman allegedly approached him on behalf of wealthy business leaders. They intended to raise a private army of 500,000 veterans backed by $3 million from J.P. Morgan to seize power and install a fascist dictatorship. The plotters wanted Butler to lead this army in Washington, D.C. to force FDR to yield power to a new dictator-like figure. While the accused publicly denied any plot as a fantasy, and the media dubbed it as a giant hoax, the congressional committee that Smedley Butler testified before concluded that the plot was discussed and planned, and they verified Butler's claims about McGuire's statements, and they found corroborating evidence in McGuire's correspondence with his wealthy backer, Robert Sterling Clark. Despite this committee confirming the existence of, planning taking place, no prosecutions actually occurred. Historians really kind of remain divided on whether the coup was a serious threat or whether, it's just this bond salesman McGuire talking shit, because, he was described by some as an inconsequential trickster. Now, I'm not going to lie here. There are a lot of, weird things surrounding this situation, but is it really out of the realm of possibility that a bunch of rich people decided to get together because they didn't want to pay increased taxes on their wealth after just having caused the Great Depression? I don't know, man. I don't know. But one certainly weird thing is that one of the representatives leading the committee was Samuel Dickstein. Dickstein. And he was later proven to be a paid agent of the Soviet NKVD, which is, their secret police, which is interesting, I guess. The other kind of weird thing is at this point, Smedley Butler was very outspoken about his left wing views. And it is odd that, all these rich business people chose him to be the leader of this plot, but I don't know. But what we do know for sure is even though the New York Times ridiculed this story as being a hoax and a conspiracy and fake news or whatever. The idea of a bond salesman orchestrating a coup at, JP Morgan, it seemed kind of hard to believe for a lot of people. But the committee did look past reporting and they did, they found evidence that, there was meetings and, planning, McGuire and Robert Sterling Clark, who was the wealthy heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, they did meet and they did at least have talks about carrying this plan out. Now, ultimately, this would become known as the business plot, and the committee's final report said that there was no question that these attempts were discussed and planned. They concluded while the army hadn't been raised, the conspiracy to raise one and oust FDR was real. From 1935 to 1937, Smedley Butler served as a spokesman for the American League Against War and Fascism, which that sounds like a cool organization. Man, we used to be a proper country. He became kind of an outspoken advocate for socialism in the United States. His views on his 33-year decorated U.S. Marine career were summarized and contextualized in the socialist magazine Common Sense in November 1935, where he said, quote, I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect their revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped to see it that Standard Oil went on its own way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. Smedley Butler would eventually die in June of 1940 after checking himself into the hospital where doctors would diagnose him with an incurable condition of his upper GI tract, which was probably cancer. He died surrounded by family and friends at Naval Hospital, Philadelphia on June 21st, 1940. His funeral was held at his home, where it was attended by friends, family, politicians, members of the Philadelphia Police Force, and officers in the United States Marine Corps. He was buried at Oakland Cemetery in West Goshen Township, Pennsylvania, where he remains till this day. Now, why am I telling you about Smedley Butler here? Well, he's an interesting man to me because at one point in his life, he really was like a true believer in American exceptionalism, imperialism, expansionism, all the isms he was a true believer in, and he played a key part in making it the way that it is now. He was a complicated guy, and he didn't reflect on his life until later. But when he began to reflect on his life later, and he wrote his book called War is a Racket, which, by the way, you should read. It's like 30 pages, and I will talk about it here in a minute. It's clear that he underwent like substantial change in his views on the world. I'm going to talk about War is a Racket here because I believe it's a great thing to talk about, and somehow it is very relevant today. Like I said, War is a Racket is a relatively short read. Then there's PDFs for free online. Like just type in War is a Racket PDF and you'll find a copy of it. I think it's full of information that I feel is still very relevant till this day. Smedley Butler, he goes into great detail talking about war profiteering and how taxpayer dollars are spent increasing company profits at, the cost of incalculable amounts of human suffering. I don't know. He estimated that U.S. participation in World War I cost about $52 billion or about $400 per person at the time, and it would create a debt burden that future generations would still be paying off. Weird. Well, the U.S. was going into debt and making American citizens responsible for corporate profits while they had to shoulder the debt burden. But these corporate profits, which were hovering around about 6 to 12% at the time, he notes that during World War I, corporate profits skyrocketed from 20, 60, 300, and even 1800%. In the book, he talks about how DuPont profits, I wonder if they've done anything bad since then, increased by 950%. How Bethlehem Steel rose from $6 million to $49 million annually. How U.S. Steel profits jumped from $105 million to $240 million. And how other commodities such as copper, nickel, leather, and sugar also increased massively, driving these companies' profits from 200 to 1700%. In his book, he also outlines wasteful and useless government spending on war that served no military purpose other than enriching manufacturers and corporations. Examples he gives are things like having 35 million pairs of shoes for only 4 million soldiers, hundreds of thousands of saddles for cavalry that didn't even exist, 20 million mosquito nets plus 40 million extra yards of netting sold to the government, which never reached France. And I don't know, are there a lot of like mosquitoes in France? I don't know. I don't know anything. Or how the government spent $1 billion on airplanes that never left the ground or never saw a battle. He talks about wooden ships costing $635 million that wouldn't even float. He talks about how 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were created from $16 billion in war profits, and soldiers bore the physical cost. Butler says that, he notes that the government plans to limit profits never included any plans to limit losses for soldiers, such as limiting the number of limbs or eyes a man can lose in war. To me, the most fascinating part of War is a Racket is when he's talking about who pays the actual price for war profits. He talks about financial manipulation through things like the Liberty Bond scheme, where bankers sold Liberty bonds to the public at $100 a piece, but they controlled the securities market, so they would, depress the price to $84 to $86 a piece, which frightened people into selling them at a loss. And then the bankers would, buy these cheap bonds back and wait for the government to restore their value, and then they would pocket the difference. He talks about the economic exploitation of the soldiers, touching on the disparity between, the nice little profits of industry, in turning into the financial ruin of the soldiers. He talks about how a soldier was paid $30 a month, yet half of this was deducted to support his dependents back at home, which, saved the government and corporations actually spending money on social programs. How $6 was deducted for accident insurance, a cost where it was initially uncovered by the employers in civilian life. What this all meant was basically soldiers were making a little less than $9 a month, less than half of what a shipyard riveter would make in like a day. Despite these poverty wages, soldiers were pressured into buying $2 billion of those same Liberty bonds, and they were basically paying for their own food and ammunition. But that's the financial cost of war, right? There's another cost that is largely lost on a lot of people for some reason. He talks about how the ultimate cost of war profits is the sanity and health of the people who fight our wars. He talks about how the military uses mass psychology to reprogram boys, just normal people, to regard murder as the order of the day. When the war ended, they were discharged without support, and they had to face it alone, many of which were never psychologically able to recover. He describes how he visited veterans hospitals that were just chock full of destroyed men. He describes one hospital in Marion, Indiana, where 1,800 normal men were kept in pens with steel bars, physically healthy, but mentally gone. He calls these people the living dead. The book condemns the methods that the military uses to recruit soldiers and hide the for-profit motive. He talks about how governments learned that they could get soldiers for cheaper by offering medals instead of money. He criticized the clergy and priesthoods for, joining the clamor to, tell soldiers it's God's will to kill the enemy. While on the other side, on the German side, their pastors were saying the same thing. He talks about how soldiers were fed ideals like making the world safe for democracy, but never told the reality that their dying would ensure huge profits, or they might get killed by weapons that were built, using U.S. patents that were sold to the enemy. At the end of War is a Racket, Smedley Butler proposes a constitutional amendment. The constitutional amendment consists of 3 specific prohibitions designed to ensure that the U.S. military is solely only used for home defense and not corporate gain. The first prohibition that he proposes is that land forces can't leave the continental United States or the Panama Canal Zone for any reason. The second prohibition he proposes is a prohibition on the Navy, which would prevent them from going more than 500 miles outside of the US coast except for mercy and humanitarian missions. The third prohibition he proposes is on aircraft, prohibiting military aircraft from flying more than 750 miles beyond the US coast. He argues the reason for these amendments is firstly that the United States is geographically safe from invasion, which, by the way, it still is today. We are very isolated from the rest of the world, and our country is gigantic, and we have a lot of terrain to cover. No serious foreign invasion is going to happen on the United States of America. It's just not going to happen. He further goes on to argue that if any serious nation or any serious foreign power would invade the United States, it would be very obvious. It's a logistical nightmare to undertake. And if they were actually trying, then the US fleet would stop them, which, I mean, it probably would. I mean, right? He also, talks about how if a foreign power were to actually invade the United States, that like most Americans would stand up and resist. Like, yes, I mean, I feel like all people, regardless of their political affiliations, race, creed, whatever, would voluntarily stand up to fight a foreign invader. I like to believe that that is just an American thing, but I'm not sure. I don't know. He argues that this constitutional amendment is important because the only wars that the U.S. routinely gets dragged into are foreign and economic conflicts, mainly motivated by profit. And to prevent this, he suggests restructuring the territories. He suggested granting independence to the Philippines, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, Wake, and Midway Islands. He viewed many of these islands as commercial liabilities and indefensible, which, by the way, if you don't know, Wake and Midway were indefensible during World War II. He proposed removing military forces from Alaska and Hawaii, saying that the threat of economic, power is all that's really needed to keep them in line. He does, however, note that the Panama Canal Zone would be, essential to national defense, and that must be protected. He says that this constitutional amendment is necessary rather than other peace methods like neutrality laws or disarmament treaties, because those are temporary and they're easily broken. He talked about how easily embargoes and stuff like that are bypassed, like, shipping machine guns as sewing machines or shipping them together. He argues that, whenever the drums beat for war, public sentiment shifts pretty quickly. He cites that the period in November 1916, Woodrow Wilson was reelected on a peace platform, but by April 1917, when the U.S. basically decided to enter World War I, how quickly the political and public sentiment changed, going from anti-war to pro-war rapidly. He says that this constitutional amendment would be preferred because it takes a lot longer to repeal a constitutional amendment. So maybe if the war drums were ever beating again, we could avoid that. He finally concludes that this amendment aligns with the constitutional framework that the founding fathers of the United States of America were intending. He states that, original militias were only intended for home defense. And he cited an incident from the War of 1812 where a militia regiment marched to the Canadian border but didn't cross it, obviously adhering to the principle of home defense. Now, why did I make this video on Smedley Butler? I think he's a fascinating individual to talk about because he's one of the most decorated servicemen in U.S. history, and I believe that his transformation and his shift in opinion, we could gain from it. We could really learn from it. Although he was problematic and he probably did a bunch of war crimes, which definitely happened. I mean, sorry. His transformation really is valuable to me. I think that it shows proof that, left-wing ideology and left-wing views are really not that unpopular. They didn't used to be before there was, the Cold War and basically the FBI, doing COINTELPRO and all that. And there was a lot of economic interests involved in the Cold War. But regardless, what I'm trying to say here is that with people like Smedley Butler, we can really learn and we can glean from their knowledge and information that they gave us. We can learn from their transformations, and we can learn on how to actually make this country better. We can learn on how to make this country better, but we can also make the world a better place. I just think he's an interesting guy to learn about, and he's probably not a person that you ever learned about in American history in high school, nor would you ever learn about this guy from the History Channel. And if you ever did, well, you probably didn't actually learn about his opinions and his beliefs and his transformation. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching.